Watching news at Prime, let's continue with reaction to the budget 2025. And joining me now is Keamogetswe Masike, President of the South African Student Federation, to react to the allocation of 55.4 billion rand for the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. Good evening to you, sir. First question, is this amount of money enough in your calculations?
Good evening, Oli, and good evening to your listeners. In actual fact, one of the things that one would say is that we stand strongly in condemning the Finance Minister's budget speech today, which is not only reckless, but a tone-deaf display of disregard to the pressing needs of ordinary South Africans and the higher education sector in general. In actual fact, it is actually shocking that the minister in his speech never alluded on anything on higher education outside that budget allocation of 50 billion rands to the National Financial Aid Scheme. Perhaps government has decommissioned higher education in this country, or perhaps maybe the assumption is that everything is fine. But however, we must state it categorically clear that the issue here is not allocation of funds to the National Financial Aid Student Scheme, but the usage of those funds. Over the past 2 years, we've seen that executive officials at the National Student Financial Aid Scheme have been using that public purse as a personal purse to pursue their personal interests, to sit in restaurants and decide over tender processes and decide over who gets to put his hands in that money. So one of our aspirations and hope in today's budget speech was to also get a sense of direction from the minister on the austerity measures that are going to be placed in making sure that that money is regulated and executive officials of these universities, gangsters who have hijacked these universities, don't put their hands in that particular purse. That must then make sure that black students across institutions of higher learning in this country, black students who have traveled across the length and breadth, rural areas, the villages, the communities, children of domestic workers, farm workers, are able to pursue higher education without any glitches or problems.
Yeah. The people that you are accusing of stealing this money, because that's what the accusation is, they're going to say, but where's the proof of what you are talking about? Let's perhaps address that quickly before we get into the finer details of what you, the students, would want to see done with this money.
It is Naledi Pandu, the former outgone minister, who said in 2018, probably, that if government does not, regulate NSFAS, the entity is bound to go for administration. And six down years the line, that entity was put under administration, where Mr. Freeman Nomvalo was given that responsibility to oversee that coffers. So the issue of corruption is not new at NSFAS. It's not; these are not allegations; these are facts. These are founded facts, where we've also had the recordings of some of these executive officials who are now are no longer presiding over that entity, sitting in restaurants, discussing on who then must be able to put hands in that particular entity that must then take black students to school. So the issue at NSFAS is not the fund allocation, but it's the character and the caliber of the people who are presiding in that particular coffers, who are then given that responsibility to make sure that poor students who deserve and who are eligible for that funding are able to get that funding. As we speak, students across all institutions of higher learning in their majority have still not received meal allowances that were due to them in the previous academic year. As we speak, there are many students who are still waiting for their NSFAS appeals to be approved. There are many students who are still waiting for their approval of NSFAS for the 2025 academic year. There are many students, as we speak, who have been accepted by NSFAS but have not received those allowances. Yeah. So the issue here at NSFAS is not about people who are presiding over this entity, but it's about the corruption that is plaguing the scheme. And the minister, Ms. Nobuhle Nkabane, we wrote to his office requesting that he gives us a comprehensive plan as to how she's going to rigorously deal with some of these issues that are plaguing that particular coffers, which we're jealous of, by the way.
Yeah. Let's talk about student accommodation, because it's perhaps one of the key points in your statement reacting to this budget today, because you're saying many students struggle to find decent and affordable accommodation. But here's the kicker for me. We urge the minister to allocate funds to develop affordable student housing, possibly through partnerships with the private sector companies. Today, the minister announcing, among other measures, that the regulations for public-private partnerships have been finalized and will take effect on the 1st of June 2025. At least that should come as some positive, is it not?
The problem, Pauli, is that many of these universities, progressive universities and these white liberal universities, is that they don't have sufficient capacity to house students in their majority, particularly those that are funded by the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. And these institutions in their majority have resorted into giving criminals that don't have, intentions of providing quality student accommodation, in particular these white student accommodation service providers. As we speak, many of our students are still stranded. They are still struggling to get proper water, proper. They are subjected to atrocious living conditions. These student accommodation service providers, they are demanding money. Many of them, they are demanding even sex from some of these students as a result of, in exchange for them to get access to that particular accommodation. So our call was that, there are many black owned businesses who are particularly, in this particular a business of student accommodation, who are currently now being told that they can't house students as a result that NSFAS is saying that the universities are then taking over this process. So we're saying that, but how can NSFAS then suggest that universities must then pilot to a NSFAS system, and then at the later stage, the very same universities instruct the minister, they instruct NSFAS and give them directives that these student accommodation providers must no longer take students. So as we speak, many of our students are homeless, by the way. Many of them are still facing the very same conditions like that I've mentioned, to say that some of these student accommodation providers don't provide adequate and conducive student accommodation to these black students.
Yeah. Final question to you. There's something quite striking that you also mentioned in your statement, which
Yes.
ought to have monies allocated towards, and that is the issue of mental health and wellness. You are asking the minister to allocate funds for mental health and wellness initiatives, including counseling services, support groups, and awareness campaigns. How deeply affected are students mentally by the conditions which you have just described, and how much money do you think should be allocated towards that?
Chloe, it's very painful, my brother, going to class without having anything to eat. It's very painful being compelled as a black student that you have an assignment to write, but your stomach is empty. It is very painful as a black student that you have a responsibility to pass at the end of the academic year, but you do not have, a conducive learning environment. So one of our greatest observations across all these institutions that we are leading is that many of these kids undergo what we call, depression, frustrations as a result of academic pressure, true frustrations as a result of socio-economic challenges that they face. Many of these kids, you might know very well that they come from these poor backgrounds. Their parents are unemployed. Many of these kids are breadwinners. So you can understand that when this pressure is exerted to them, they then resort, to alcohol, drugs, and all these manner of things that are self-destructing in an institution of higher learning. So our clear call was that the minister must also then be able to delve deeper in the issue of mental health, because the issue of mental health is not only important in the basis that it assists a student to be healthy and to go to class and pass, but the well-being and the welfare of a student across the institution of higher learning. The student is then able, to self-sustain, and then the student is also able to, to pass academically and all of that. And then one of also our greatest observation is that the issue of menstrual hygiene, many of these girls are still, that's still a pandemic in this country. And many of these black daughters and sisters who are our sisters, by the way, are still suffering in that regard. So it's very important that government, whenever they are allocating funds, whenever they're making all these policy developments and all of that, they ought to delve deeper in the issue of mental health, and they ought to delve deeper into making sure that many of these kids, when they are in an institution of higher learning, they don't self-destruct, but they are there, they are able to go to school and study and pursue what they went there to do.
Keamogetswe Masike, I want to thank you very much for your time, a representative of the South African Student Federation. So